Hej och välkomna till Udda Ting, en podcast om sällsamma historier, kreativitet och kreatörerna själva. Jag heter Henrik Möller, musiken är komponerad av Testbild och den fina loggan till podden är skapad av Malmökonstnären Nalle Chinsky. Det här avsnittet ska handla om författaren Thomas Ligotti. Vissa har kallat honom för Lovecrafts arvtagare, men Ligotti har en helt annan stil och hans gudar, demoner och allmänt övernaturliga ting verkar leva endast i huvudpersonernas hjärnor som en sorts sjukdom. Och det verkar som att han vill smitta oss läsare med denna sjukdom när vi läser honom. Ligotti verkar hela tiden vara mer av en filosof än en fiktionsförfattare, djupt deprimerad och nattsvarta hopplösa argument genomsyrar böckerna. Speciellt hans filosofiska roman The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, som argumenterar för att mänskligheten borde ta sitt ansvar, sluta knulla och självdö för planetens bästa. Det var denna bok, skriven 2010, som trots att Ligotti var aktiv redan sedan tidigt 80-tal gav honom ett oväntat uppsving genom en kontrovers som han själv varken hade något att göra med eller numera vill ta i med tång. I korta drag var det så här. I första säsongen av tv-serien True Detective fanns enligt Ligotti-fansen hela meningar kopierade ur Conspiracy Against the Human Race och givna till karaktären Rustin Cole, som var något av det starkaste i hela serien. Saken komplicerades av att manusförfattaren Nick Pizzolatto tidigare hade berättat att Ligotti var en av hans stora inspirationskällor. Fansen var alltså förbannade för att Ligotti skulle haft cred, men ingenting blev av. I synnerhet för att Ligotti själv var ointresserad av att stämma Nick Pizzolatto. Det bästa med allt det här var att Ligotti blev uppmärksammad på en högre nivå, och detta resulterade med stor säkerhet i att det stora bokförlaget Penguin då gav ut honom och introducerade honom för en mycket större publik än den han haft på independentbolagen de senaste 35 åren. Jag har hela tiden velat göra ett avsnitt om Ligotti, men problemet ligger i att det finns inte så mycket känt om honom. Ligotti avskyr offentligheten något extremt. Av alla de jag har träffat är det bara över mail som de har haft kontakt med honom. Det är endast Joe Pulver i form av förläggare som pratat med honom på telefon, så vitt jag vet. Joe Pulver berättar om första gången han upptäckte Ligotti.
Bob Price knew Ligotti. And Cisco and I and some other writers would go to Bob Price's house for these little writers groups. And all kinds of information was exchanged, and we'd read stories to each other and whatnot. And Bob, because Bob had been the editor of Crypto Cthulhu for over 10 years. And Crypto Cthulhu early on did an all Ligotti issue. The Crypto Cthulhu was one of the places where Ligotti sort of got his start. And when when Cisco was looking for a publisher, Bob Price turned him on to Ligotti as far as a reference point. And Ligotti ultimately led Cisco to Jeff Vandermeer, and Cisco got published. But Cisco and Ligotti hit it off.
So, Michael Cisco and Ligotti were friends?
Friends as far as Ligotti's ever friends with anybody.
Have you met him in person?
No. None of us anywhere have ever met Ligotti. None of us are ever going to meet Ligotti. It's not that he's a bad guy, because Ligotti is very down to earth. He's very friendly. He's awful warm. I've had the honor, pleasure, privilege of talking to him a few times on the phone. We've exchanged email over the years on subjects, more on music than anything else. Not unknown, but to the general public unknown. Ligotti loves the shadows. Who are kind of like the British Ventures, and people would go, huh? The Ventures? Isn't that like surf music? And you listen to the Shadows, and the Shadows are covering surf songs, and they're covering pop tunes. They're instrumental, two guitars, bass, and drums covering anything from The Look of Love to Apache to A Whiter Shade of Pale. And this is the stuff that pops Ligotti's cork. He just,
Han hade från början musikambitioner och spelade i ett band, men hans kraftigt tilltagande depression gav honom så svår social fobi att han sakta men säkert drog sig tillbaka. På senare år har han haft ett samarbete med bandet Current 93, där hans ungdomsvän David Tibet spelar. Ligotti spelade gitarr på en av deras skivor och har bidragit med låttexter och albumtitlar som In a Foreign Town, in a Foreign Land från 1997, I Have a Special Plan for This World från 2000, This Degenerate Little Town från 2001 och The Unholy City 2003. Vill man höra Ligotti själv läsa sina dikter så kan man lyssna på The Unholy City-skivan, där de ackompanjeras av David Tibet på gitarr. Skivan trycktes bara i cirka 500 ex år 2002, men det finns som tur för oss som har missat det tåget upplagt på YouTube. Så bara ut och lyssna.
Ligotti wrote some things called death poems, and Tibet of course loved them and wanted to record them and asked Tom to read them, and then Tibet created background music for them. There's 6 things. The player who takes no chances. You do not own your head. No one knows the big news. Welcome to the unholy city. My name is nothing. And nobody is anybody. And they're all around 4 minutes long. It was a very short CD, 4, 8, 12, 15, 18, 21 minutes. It was more like a, mini disc kind of thing. And I've had the chance to see and meet Tibet twice.
Did you talk to David Tibet about Thomas Ligotti?
Yeah, we talked about Tom, we talked about me writing, we talked about Current 93,
Om Current 93 säger Thomas Ligotti: What I like most about Current 93's work is its sheer visionary intensity, and what I like to consider is its morbidity and world disgust. Angående musik säger Ligotti i en intervju: The only important thing in my life is to avoid suffering any more pain than I have to, and to assist people who are close to me in doing the same, in principle. In fact, music has been a significant diversion for me from the time I got my first transistor radio and heard those dopey songs from the early 60s, which now sound so haunting to me. Popsicles and Icicles is a tune that particularly stands out as beautiful and otherworldly as something by the Cocteau Twins. I don't think that music has had any direct influence on my stories, except perhaps in some cryptic way that I can't even recognize. I have on one occasion tried to conceive of a work of fiction that would have the intensity and impact of a musical composition, but writing doesn't work that way. Its effect on people is weaker, but much more intimate than that of music. Music seems to come from a million miles away, while writing is inside you. What makes Ligotti's work so effective?
As human beings / animals, if we go all the way back to the cave, night falls. It is dark beyond the campfire. We have no natural protection. We don't have claws. We don't have teeth. Our weapons at that point are so primitive as to be useless. We don't know anything. Perhaps that far back we haven't created gods. So what's beyond the reach of the firelight at night is this great blackness that's filled with rustling and noises. And we're terrified. There are all these dark mysteries. So as we move along, as we evolve, as we invent and become what we are over the millenniums, we fill in holes. But I think there's an essence, some part of us, that mystery is irresistible. And that there's always this air of mystery in Ligotti. His language is just so beautiful. He's one of our greatest wordsmiths. As far as atmosphere, at least for my money, and I think for a lot of readers, there are a lot of people out there who think that Ligotti's one of the truly great practitioners of atmosphere. Again, when I was talking about O'Connell earlier, how when you walk into a room, even though that woman may not be there any longer, this whiff of her perfume still is. With Ligotti, it's the same kind of thing. There's something there. It's not just the words we're seeing and reading. There's other things going on.
Ligottis historier kräver en viss delaktighet av läsaren. Det vill säga att låta det som står i texten sjunka in och expandera. Ofta så kommer skräcken en stund efter man har läst den, när man tänker tillbaka på det man har läst. Han har en teknik som enligt mig först går ut på att frammana en sorts depression hos läsaren för att då riva skyddsmurarna så att säga och sedan anfalla med sin så kallade skräck. Oftast så går dessa två element hand i hand hos Ligotti. Jag läste en bit ur boken The Ring Companion om filmerna The Ring, amerikanska som japanska, där det poängteras att de inte är katarsis-skräckfilmer eller för den delen skoja splatterskräckfilmer. Citatet följer: They induce not pleasurable fear, life-affirming and cathartic, but rather depression and psychosis, unhealthy and downright dangerous. Created like a Defense Department study into techniques of psychological warfare. Ganska dramatisk beskrivning. Jag uppskattar det. Men hur som helst så blir poängen att om man ska känna riktig skräck så är det rätt väg att gå. Det finns många intressanta skräcktekniker som jag vill tala med någon som är insatt i det där ute. Är det någon där ute som har eller bara hobbyforskat på ämnet så hör gärna av er. Jag tänkte till exempel på creepypasta eller inom IT-världens Rocco's Basilisk, där tankeexperimentet gick ut på att folk skulle stödja forskningen och produktionen av en artificial intelligence. Annars skulle just denna artificial intelligence komma för att hämnas i framtiden på alla som kände till den men inte hjälpte till nu så att säga, för att stödja forskningen. Det är lite som att läsa Lovecrafts Necronomicon, att när du väl läste kan det inte bli oläst. Du är nu delaktig av information och dömd till inferno. Så vad ska du nu göra? Ska du berätta det för någon annan och sprida smittan vidare? Trots att folk insåg logiskt att detta tankeexperiment var ohållbart övertogs logiken hos vissa av primala rädslor och hjärnspöken och internet överflödades av folk som mådde psykiskt dåligt efter att ha läst teorin om Rocco's Basilisk. Det hela komplicerades av att originaltråden raderades och sidan förbjöd folk att fortsätta diskussionen kring ämnet och därmed skapades en myt som bara fortsatte att växa. Snart efterlyste stora företag liknande bra idéer i marknadsföringssyfte. Jag tycker att idén om psykologiskt ångestframkallande krigsföring som reklam åt stora företag lät som en intressant idé för en skräckhistoria och kanske något för en författare av Ligottis kaliber att skriva om. Att Ligotti inte skrivit någon skräckroman utan som Lovecraft bara i short story-formatet förklaras här rätt bra av Jeff Vandermeer.
With weird fiction, it is harder if all you're writing is weird fiction to write novels in the first place because the suspension of disbelief on the reader's part, the strategies that you use to scare readers and to create a sense of unease are hard to maintain over the longer length in the first place. And I think I see that when you're dealing with certain kinds of situations that are not real world situations, they just are harder to sustain undiluted. It's different if you're writing straight up naturalistic horror like Stephen King, or if you're writing something that's a mix of fantasy and weird fiction. But it does seem like the concentrated dread and the unease and the anxiety and the paranoia that often comes along with weird fiction, number one, is hard to inhabit as a writer at a longer length for too long without kind of going nuts. And then the other thing is that it's just harder to maintain that as the primary thing that's driving your narrative. And I also think readers after a while don't necessarily want to be in that place for that long. And, that's again why Stephen King works at novel length because he's not really doing the same thing. He's doing a more diluted version in a sense. He's not pure weird fiction. He's writing naturalistic horror, which has different tropes, different, and usually has larger sets of characters. That's the other thing, is usually in weird fiction, you're inhabiting at most one or two character points of view, and you're kind of deep in to whatever it is they're seeing. And again, that's harder to maintain for a longer length. And then I just meant that, endurance wise, it is true that if you have a novel out, it takes a lot more out of you because there's a whole PR cycle to do. There's the whole pre-production. There's all these expectations about sales and all of that. And it can burn you out over time in a way that just having a story collection out is not really at the same, level of intensity. But I have no idea how, it might not make a difference to Ligotti at all because Ligotti is not going to be doing press tours anyway.
Matt Cardin skrev en plot summary så att säga, en sammanfattning av historien The Shadow at the Bottom of the World, och jag tänker läsa lite av det här nu. The Shadow at the Bottom of the World relates the story of an unspecified rural town which experiences an unnatural prolongation of the autumn season one year. The sights, the sounds, and the smells of autumn ripen to an almost unbearable pitch, until one night the town's residents see a scarecrow begin to move in a grotesque fashion in a farmer's field on the edge of town. They gather the next day to examine the scarecrow, and when they attack it and remove its outer garments, they discover not the expected wooden frame, but something black and twisted into the form of a man, something that seemed to have come up from the earth and grown over the wooden planks like a dark fungus, consuming the structure. In a vague communal panic, they dig deep into the earth to find the base of the stalk, but no matter how far they dig, they cannot find its end. By the next day, the stalk has disappeared. It's gone back, says the farmer who owns the field, gone into the earth like something hiding in its shell. And in its place there is now a wide and seemingly bottomless pit. The overripe autumn season continues to linger over the following days and weeks until eventually the townspeople's dreams are affected. Där har vi en liten sammanfattning av The Shadow at the Bottom of the World. Och nu får ni också lite känsla för stämningen och det här onämnbara obehaget som Ligotti frammanar. Jag träffade ett gäng 20-åriga killar och tjejer på en festival som var drivna nihilister och avgudade Ligotti. De tyckte att han var true, vilket jag kan förstå för man känner verkligen den nattsvarta cynismen och depressionen i hans noveller. De tyckte att det var gött att man kände att författaren verkligen ville ta livet av sig. En av dessa kids hade Ligottis adress i Miami och hade en idé om att göra en dokumentärfilms road movie för att besöka honom, som då skulle sluta i någonting i stil med att Ligotti bara stod och tittade fram bakom en gardin i sitt hus och vägrade öppna dörren. I Daryl Schweitzers samling av Ligotti-essäer finns en intervju med Ligotti där han berättar att han var besatt av skräckfilmer som barn och kollade så ofta han bara kunde. Verkligheten var någonting att fly ifrån. Han berättar att han fick en radio i födelsedagspresent så han kunde lyssna på sporten. Varje söndag lyssnade han maniskt för att slippa tänka på måndagen och skolan som låg runt hörnet. Men han kunde bara få in en kanal och på den kanalen kördes bara hockey som han hatade. Deprimerande, säger Ligotti, att sitta hemma de sista timmarna innan helvetet bröt loss och lyssna på en sport som han hatade. Ligottis humor är tydligare i intervjuerna än i novellerna. Men enligt Jeff Vandermeer så gömmer den sig där också. Författaren Jeff Vandermeer berättar om första gången han upptäckte Ligotti.
Well, we actually have the first edition of his first collection, Songs from a Dead Dreamer, which I think was only out in a 300-copy edition back in the late 80s. I think we got it at the first or second World Horror Convention in Nashville, and so that's I've known about him since then, and he was actually very useful and influential in that he read over the manuscript of parts of City of Saints and Mad Men and gave me comments on it. And I recently wrote the introduction to the Penguin Classics edition of Songs of a Dead Dreamer and Grimscribe, the follow-up. And what I find so interesting about him is that he does have a very sly sense of humor, that once you kind of become accustomed to the weird elements in his fiction, you can see kind of a dark strand of humor in there as well. And some of it is Kafkaesque because he has these workplace stories that are actually based on his own workplace experiences that are very, very odd and very horrific. But what I just like, again, that, you know, he started out influenced by Lovecraft, but he moved on to become his own kind of writer. And along with Caitlin Kiernan, I think he's one of the most original weird writers of the 20th and 21st century. He just has his own sensibility, and he manages to unnerve. And, you know, he has weird puppet shows and weird parades and things in his fiction that are very evocative and scary, and yet also somehow kind of darkly beautiful. He has a story called The Red Tower, which you could read as a critique of capitalism, but is also this seriously creepy kind of abandoned factory story. He plays around with narrative in interesting ways. He's to say that, you know, he has two modes. He has this mode where a kind of ordinary character becomes slowly enmeshed in some very strange situation. Like even I think he has one story with Harlequin in the title, I can't remember, that is about a guy going to an academic conference and the weird things that happen. And then he has the ones where he just doesn't really care about giving you standard characterization, like Red Tower, or the one with puppets, where he's just basically setting up a weird scenario, and it's almost like the Brothers Quay or something with their stopgap animation, where he's more interested in just simply the aesthetics of the weird than he is in a traditional story mode. And those two things are what he does very well. Kind of this normalization of weird stuff within a kind of ordinary life with a narrator who's usually nameless, or he does the other thing. Then again, with kind of a David Lynch kind of sense to it, and they're very hypnotic stories. They don't really, you know, you wouldn't, if you described some of them to somebody, they would say, well, that sounds kind of boring. But when you actually read them, they take hold of you, and the way that he creates atmosphere and kind of a sense of dread pulls you through the story. And I think his work will stand alongside work by Kafka and Poe at the end of the day.
You live in Miami, and Ligotti lives in Miami. Have you ever run across each other?
No one runs into Ligotti. Ligotti's fairly reclusive, and I would not kind of like try to impose myself on him anyway. He values his privacy, and it's enough to correspond with him via email.
Weird fiction forskaren S.T. Joshi.
The Weird Tale. It was published in 1990, and almost immediately thereafter, I said, well, I really need to write about more contemporary writers, by which I mean basically leading writers since Lovecraft. I remember receiving a review copy of his first book, Songs of a Dead Dreamer, which was published at that time, this was all the way back in 1986, by a very small press in the United States called Silver Scarab Press. Frankly, not very well produced. It was an unattractive looking volume. And I simply dispensed with it as what is called fan fiction. I thought it was just some tyro writing these stories and somehow managed to persuade this publisher to issue them. So I didn't even read the book. I think I gave my copy away to somebody. But then Stefan said, this guy, Thomas Ligotti, is someone you really need to consider in your book on the modern Weird Tale. And I was quite skeptical. I said, who is this Ligotti person? What has he done, really? At that time, he had written a new edition of Songs of a Dead Dreamer, came out in 1989, and I think Grimscribe had come out. That's his second volume. I read Songs of a Dead Dreamer, and I tell you, I received a thrill of horror that I have not received in decades. I realized he was the goods. I mean, he was the real thing there. Not only his incredibly dense prose, but the really bizarre misanthropic imagination that just thrilled me and haunted me. I quickly became convinced that he and Ramsey Campbell were probably the two leading writers of weird fiction of that era. If you read his book, the nonfiction book, which we talked about last time, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, you realize what a dark, pessimistic, and indeed misanthropic vision of the world he has. And I make no moral judgments about that. I think I'm a bit of a misanthrope myself. I have no problem with misanthropy. I'm not inclined toward pessimism, but that's just for personal reasons. But I can understand why someone might be a pessimist. And that vision gets infused into his work in such a powerful way that it just draws you in. And there's something so distinctive about his imagination. There is no other writer in this field, or any field, as far as I can tell, who is like him. He has such again, this is not meant to be pejorative. He has a really twisted view of the universe, very, very, very strange, and is able to express that view through language that is so carefully manipulated that it just creates this tremendous atmosphere of terror.
Om jag ska nämna ett par av Ligottis noveller för den som är sugen att börja någonstans, så kan jag för Lovecraft-fanatiken rekommendera Last Feast of Harlequin, som till och med är dedikerad till Lovecraft. Om man däremot vill gå direkt på Ligottis säregna stil är det The Bungalow House som är en bra början. Den handlar om en ensam man som börjar äta sin lunchlåda in i ett nästintill tomt konstgalleri tvärs över gatan. En dag så upptäcker han en konstinstallation som är en ljudinspelning av märkliga drömmonologer. Och han blir snabbt besatt av dem och vill veta vem konstnären är. Men galleristen vägrar berätta och säger att upphovsmannen har begärt att få bli anonym. Huvudpersonen rasar och hans besatthet blir bara värre och värre tills en dag galleristen får nog. Men mer säger jag inte. Jag skulle kunna hålla på ett bra tag här, men att fånga Ligottis krypande skräck är nästan omöjligt, och när man berättar om de här historierna så här rätt upp och ner så låter det snarare banalt tråkigt. Författaren Brian Evenson.
A great place to start would be Grimscribe or Songs of the Dead Dreamer. I mean, I think with Ligotti it's hard to go wrong. Probably my favorite Ligotti is My Work Is Not Yet Done, which is a longer piece, and it's about an office building in which strange things are happening, and I just think it's really nicely done.
För er som vill läsa Ligotti på svenska så finns det faktiskt en samling, Skuggan på världens botten, som gavs ut 2011. Och den finns både fortfarande att köpa som paperback och låna på biblioteket, i alla fall på Stadsbiblioteket i Malmö. Vi avslutar med Ramsey Campbells fråga till Ligotti från Lovecraft E-Scene-intervjun, där de lät olika författare, fans och forskare ställa varsin fråga till Ligotti. Ramsey Campbell frågar: What do you think time and space are for, and what do they mean to you? Thomas Ligotti svarar: Time and space, or space-time, are what death needs to grow in. That's what I think they are for, and that's also what they mean to me. While other positions have argued, none of them can be proven. For instance, according to surrealist physician Jean-Paul Jean, space-time is for polishing goldfish, thus giving their scales a radiant sheen. Jean-Paul flaunts an excellent case, in principle, though his theory obliges him to commit suicide. I wish mine did, if only in principle. Ja, det var allt för den här gången. Jag heter Henrik Möller och musiken är skriven av Testbild. Hej då!